Hello, my name is Bradley Garrett.
Hey, I'm James Arnock.
How have you interacted with salt marshes in your personal career?
So in my personal career, if you could even call it that, for the past 2 summers, not including this last one, I've been a naturalist in Island Beach State Park in New Jersey. And what we do there is, that's a state park on a salt marsh behind Barnegat Inlet, New Jersey. And we do a lot of educational outreach type service events. And it's a really great way to educate the youth about salt marshes and ways that we can conserve them. Now that I'm here, I do my graduate research on reconstructing sea level rise in North Carolina, and we do a lot of coring of the local marshes here in Wilmington.
Can you define shoreline stabilization for coastal marshes in your own words?
Sure. So shoreline stabilization is anything that we do as humans to anchor sediment in place on our shorelines and prevent erosion from happening. And that can be on the ocean front, on the back bays, on rivers, on lakes. It doesn't matter if it's salt or fresh water.
Can you explain why shoreline stabilization is a plausible method to restore coastal marshes?
Sure. So it's not the only thing that we need to be doing, but it's one of the many fronts we need to be tackling marsh restoration on. If we can stabilize the shoreline, we can prevent sediment loss, and that's a big part of the battle.
Have any methods changed over time with the rise of new technology?
Yeah, definitely. So I think 20 or 30 years ago, it was much more popular to implement what's called a hard structure on our coastlines. So that's things like seawalls, like bulkheads, basically concrete, wooden, metal, just hard structures that anchor the shoreline in one fixed position.
Which method have you seen work most effectively?
Nowadays, it's all about the living shorelines. So I mentioned hard strategies before. So now it's all about what's called soft strategies. So they take a combination of things like planting dune grasses to hold vegetation in place with oysters to improve water quality and reduce wave energy. And they combine all of that, maybe even with some more minor hard structures. And the idea here is that we're causing the maximum sediment retention and preventing the most erosion, while at the same time mitigating some of the negative effects that those purely hard structures have.
Can you give me some examples locally where we have living shoreline?
Sure. So if you've ever been to the Center for Marine Science off the docks behind there's a bunch of different living shorelines, and a lot of student research goes on back there. Also at St. James Plantation behind Oak Island, there's another few experimental living shorelines being put in. And I know one of the other graduate students in our department, Mark Moore, is doing some research to see how living shorelines actually affect wave energy and sediment retention.
Very cool. In what ways have living shorelines helped the plant and animal life?
I would say it's really mostly about the habitat retention for them. So the biggest thing is when we put in a hard structure, like a seawall, for example, one of the biggest negatives is that we eliminate all of this transitional habitat for shorebirds, for crabs, for small nursery fish, etc. So when we have a living shoreline, we do our very best to retain that habitat while still protecting the land behind it for our uses. There's also water quality issues with, especially around here with Gen X and all of that good stuff. So one of the professors in our department is actually doing work with oysters and how they increase water quality and maybe might have some Gen X removal.
Are there areas in North Carolina where protection of marshland is needed more than others?
Yeah, so I would say up in Kill Devil Hills in the Outer Banks, there's an erosional Rodanthe in the Outer Banks. There's an erosional hotspot up there right now. They're losing about 15 feet of shoreline per year. And you can actually see on the ocean side rows where it used to be 2 or 3 blocks of houses that is now completely fallen into the sea. And it's just a very impressive sight, especially if you're from America and you're not used to seeing that kind of thing.
With a growing coastal population, how does this affect the marsh?
So one of the biggest things with marshes is compounding stressors. So humans aside, they have to deal with things like sea level rise, which is occurring on its own. And then if we put in our own pollutional stressors, and then we further accelerate the natural rates of sea level rise, those things compound on top of one another. And normally with just the natural rates of sea level rises, these marshes can accrete sediment at the same rate. And we won't have to deal with loss of shoreline with that. But when we add in the compounding stressors from human interactions with the environment, then we start to see massive loss of shorelines.
As a final note, what do we need to do as a community to really tackle this problem of stabilizing shorelines?
So one of the biggest things I would say is education and just getting people on the same page. Because one of the biggest problems is just a fundamental disagreement between what works and what doesn't. So if we have good science supporting and good data to show us really what works, and then we have good education to communicate that data and that science, then I think we can really start to tackle this problem.